What if I told you that the most bullish document ever written about XRP was written by the banks trying to destroy it? Not by Ripple, not by Brad Garlinghouse, not by a crypto analyst with a YouTube channel, by the lobbying organization that represents the biggest banks in the United States. They filed a formal letter with a federal regulator. They put Ripple's name inside it. They signed it. They submitted it. And in doing so, they accidentally handed every XRP holder the most powerful confirmation this space has ever produced. Because here's the thing about lobbying letters that almost nobody talks about. You do not spend legal resources, political capital, and the credibility of 42 member banks opposing something that is not threatening. The ICBA and the Bank Policy Institute did not file against XRP because Ripple is weak. They filed because Ripple is close. And close, documented, signed, submitted to a federal office, is the only word that matters in this story. Welcome back to XRP News Flow Signals, where we track the moves institutions make when they think retail isn't watching. This is not financial advice. Always do your own research. But if you want to understand why two of the most powerful banking lobby organizations in America just put Ripple's name in a federal filing, and what that actually signals, let's get into it. Let's start with the hard truth that almost no coverage of this story is willing to say plainly. When a legacy institution files a lobbying letter against a competitor, they are not expressing concern. They are expressing fear. And fear in institutional finance does not get spent carelessly. It gets spent strategically, with lawyers, with timing, and with specific targets. The first organization, the ICBA, the Independent Community Bankers of America. They submitted a formal letter of opposition to the OCC, targeting Zero Hash's application for a national trust bank charter. But read past the cover page, and the target is not just Zero Hash. The letter explicitly names Circle, Ripple, Paxos, and Payoneer, not as examples, as concerns. They are telling a federal regulator in writing that companies like Ripple should not be trusted with banking infrastructure. The second organization, the BPI, the Bank Policy Institute. In July 2025, they filed a separate action attempting to block Ripple's banking license application directly. The BPI is not a grassroots advocacy group. It is a policy lobbying organization representing over 42 of the largest banks in the United States. JP Morgan is on that board. Bank of America is on that board. Wells Fargo is on that board. Read that again slowly. The bank where you deposited your paycheck this week may be actively funding the legal effort designed to delay the infrastructure you hold in your portfolio. That is not a theory. That is the documented structure of how institutional lobbying works in the U.S. financial system. Now ask yourself the question that the financial press is completely refusing to ask. Why these companies? Why now? And why in writing? The answer is a number: 17.9 trillion. That is the approximate value of consumer deposits currently sitting inside the U.S. banking system. Under fractional reserve rules, banks are legally required to hold only a fraction of that capital on hand. The rest gets deployed into mortgage portfolios, commercial lending desks, short-duration bond positions, generating returns that never appear on your statement. Every dollar that moves into a self-custodied wallet, a stablecoin account, or an XRP-based settlement layer is a dollar that exits that yield machine. The lobbying letter is not about consumer protection. It is about consumer deposits. And the math behind protecting those deposits is why Ripple's name ended up in a federal filing. Let's run the math that the banks have already run, because they did not arrive at these lobbying filings without a spreadsheet. $17.9 trillion in U.S. consumer deposits. Under fractional reserve banking, assume an average net interest margin of roughly 2.5% on deployed capital. That represents approximately $400 to $450 billion in annual yield generated by U.S. banks on money that belongs to their depositors. Not yield paid to depositors, yield kept by banks. Now understand what happens to that model when XRP-based settlement infrastructure scales. On-demand liquidity through the XRP Ledger eliminates the need for pre-funded Nostro and Vostro accounts. The $27 trillion in idle correspondent banking capital that currently lubricates cross-border flows globally. Settlement in 3 to 5 seconds eliminates the float periods, the weekend delay windows, the wire cutoff games that generate yield during transit. A bridge asset that settles directly between currencies eliminates the intermediary chain that charges a fee at every node. This is not a marginal efficiency improvement. This is a structural removal of the friction that the current banking model is built to profit from. The ICBA's own letter, in its attempt to warn the OCC about consumer risk, makes 3 specific arguments. First, customers of crypto-native companies lack FDIC insurance. Second, the OCC is approving applications too fast, 11 filings or conditional approvals in under 100 days. Third, approving companies like Ripple creates systemic financial risk. Here is what the letter does not mention. Zero Hash, Ripple, Circle. These companies hold far more than the 10% fractional reserve minimum that ICBA member banks are legally required to maintain. The organizations warning about consumer protection are operating on thinner reserves than the companies they are warning against. The irony is not accidental, and it tells you exactly what the lobbying is actually protecting. Now connect this to the OCC's response, because this is where the story turns. Despite 2 separate formal lobbying filings from 2 of the most well-resourced banking lobby organizations in the country, the OCC did not slow down. They processed 11 applications in under 100 days. The ICBA cited that number as evidence the regulator was moving recklessly. Read it differently, a federal regulatory body accelerated crypto approvals under active lobbying pressure and did not stop. That is not a regulator that is uncertain. That is a regulator that has made a directional decision and is executing on it. When the most powerful banking lobby in America cannot slow a regulator down, the window where lobbying succeeds is closing, and the window where infrastructure gets approved is opening. Let's talk about what the broader regulatory picture tells us, because the lobbying does not exist in a vacuum. On April 2nd, 2026, Coinbase received conditional approval from the OCC to become a U.S. trust bank. This is the same OCC that the ICBA warned was moving too fast. The same OCC that the BPI tried to pressure into slowing down. They approved a crypto-native company anyway. Ripple is pursuing that exact same charter. In CEO Monica Long's own words, Ripple's OCC application is not about operating as a traditional bank. It is specifically designed to give RLUSD, Ripple's USD-pegged stablecoin on the XRP Ledger, federal-level regulatory credibility. The kind of credibility that allows RLUSD to be used as institutional collateral, as a settlement instrument, as a treasury management tool for entities that require federal oversight standards before they can deploy capital. Coinbase just proved the template works. The argument that the OCC would never approve a crypto-native company is no longer an argument. It is a historical footnote. And now the Genius Act. Stablecoin legislation advancing in Congress is adding a second front. The same lobbying organizations that filed against Ripple's charter are now lobbying against stablecoin legislation that would give RLUSD a defined legal lane to operate inside the U.S. financial system. 2 fronts. Same organizations, same argument, same motive. But here is the institutional signal that cuts through all of it. When the White House publicly signals openness to digital asset infrastructure, at the same time the OCC accelerates approvals, at the same time bipartisan stablecoin legislation advances in Congress, the lobbying pressure is fighting a directional tide, not a single decision. The banks understand this. That is why the filings are escalating rather than stopping. Organizations that believe they are winning do not escalate. Organizations that see their window closing file faster, argue harder, and name more names. The BPI targeted Ripple's charter directly. That escalation is the tell. Smart money reads opposition filings the same way a doctor reads a symptom, not as the disease, as the diagnostic. The diagnosis: Ripple is close enough to chartered banking infrastructure that the entities with the most to lose have moved from ignoring it to fighting it in writing. Before we get into the catalyst timeline, because the next 90 days are extraordinarily specific, I want to say something directly. What we are building at XRP News Flow Signals is not a hype feed. It is a signal tracker. We go into the lobbying filings, the OCC pipelines, the congressional records, and the regulatory timelines, and we separate what is noise from what is structure. If that kind of analysis is what you have been missing, subscribe right now and turn on notifications. Because when the OCC charter decision on Ripple drops, you will not want to be reading about it 2 days after the price has already moved. You want the context before the move. That is what this channel is for. Let's be precise, because the next 90 days are not vague. They have specific decision points attached to them. Catalyst 1. Ripple's OCC charter decision. The application is active. The OCC has demonstrated it processes crypto applications under lobbying pressure without stopping. Coinbase's conditional approval on April 2nd established the template. Ripple's application carries a more complete infrastructure argument: payments, stablecoin, bridge asset, and a BBB-rated holding company in Ripple Prime. The moment conditional approval arrives, RLUSD's institutional deployment capability changes category. Catalyst 2. The Genius Act, stablecoin legislation. The Genius Act is advancing in Congress with bipartisan support. If passed, it creates a defined federal legal lane for stablecoins like RLUSD to operate inside the regulated financial system. The ICBA is lobbying against it using the same arguments they used in their OCC letter. The outcome of this legislation sets the infrastructure conditions for every institutional payment corridor RLUSD is positioned to serve. Catalyst 3. The Digital Asset Clarity Act. Senate markup imminent. Bipartisan momentum building. When this passes alongside stablecoin legislation, it does not open a door. It removes an entire structural barrier for U.S. domiciled institutional allocators. Catalyst 4. BPI and ICBA lobbying disclosures. Congressional lobbying disclosure filings are public and quarterly. The next disclosure cycle will show exactly how much capital the banking lobby is deploying against Ripple and digital asset legislation. That number, when it rises, is itself a signal of how seriously they are taking the threat. 4 live catalysts, none speculative, all on a visible regulatory timeline. Here is what the lobbying tells you about timing that no price chart can. Lobbying campaigns have a shelf life. They are most effective in the early stages of a regulatory decision, before a directional posture is established, before political cover solidifies, before the legal merits of applications become undeniable. The OCC is already 11 approvals deep in under 100 days. The political cover from the White House is public. The Coinbase template is established. Ripple's SEC case is resolved. The ICBA and BPI are not lobbying at the beginning of this story. They are lobbying at the end of their window. When the window closes, the obstruction timeline ends, and what follows the obstruction timeline is the adoption timeline. The two do not run simultaneously. One ends, the other begins. Let me leave you with the frame that makes all of this land correctly. The most bullish document ever written about XRP was written by the banks trying to stop it. The ICBA spent legal capital putting Ripple's name in a federal filing because Ripple is close to something worth protecting against. The BPI mobilized 42 member banks, JP Morgan, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, because the fractional reserve yield machine that generates hundreds of billions annually is structurally threatened by what Ripple is building. You do not mobilize that kind of institutional firepower against a company that is not going to win. You mobilize it because you see the timeline, and you are running out of moves. The lobbying letters are not the story. They are the confirmation. And the confirmation belongs to every XRP holder who has stayed positioned through the noise long enough to read what the opposition is actually saying. If this breakdown gave you signal where you are seeing noise, subscribe to XRP News Flow Signals before the OCC decision drops. We are tracking every filing, every disclosure, every regulatory movement in real time. When the charter decision comes, this community will have the context that turns a headline into a strategic understanding. Drop one word below. Window if you think the lobbying fails. Wall if you think it succeeds. I read every single one. Stay sharp. The signal is louder than the noise if you know where to listen.